If you're trying to get attention, water is unfortunately like a great target because it's an essential service, so people worry about it.
We take it for granted, but our local water supply is a prime attack surface for hackers. And it's not alone. It's a call for an all-hands response to an alarming threat environment as we put the future of cybersecurity in context. Episode 122 begins right now.
TFIC takes you deeper into the stories that are shaping the future of state and local government.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
You're not Buzz Lightyear.
I'm Siri.
And I'm Google.
And I am Alexa.
Alexa seems so smart, I think we'd have a lot to talk about.
Pew, pew.
From government technology and governing, this is a brand new season of The Future in Context. With Paul Taylor, I am Ashley Silver. Cybersecurity breaches are relentless. By one estimate, there are 13 attacks per second, putting us on pace for over 420 million attacks this year. Our new season opens with the cover story episode with the writers from Government Technology who put the package together. Paul sat down with Jewel Patterson-Gordon and Thad Reuter.
Jewel and Thad, welcome back to the big show.
Glad to be here.
We have an annual ritual now, Cybersecurity Awareness Month in October, and the fall issue of Government Technology magazine includes a cover story package on cybersecurity and protecting critical infrastructure. It struck me, though, that this annual Cybersecurity Awareness Month and all the attendant activity could mask the point that when it comes to protecting vital infrastructure, it's a day-to-day chore and challenge, particularly for public agencies where cybersecurity is neither a core mission or core competency. Jewel, let's begin with you. Your piece focused on some infrastructure that we take for granted most of the time around water and power, particularly. We'll talk about the third element in a second. But when you think about water, what are the core threats and also where are the weaknesses?
Absolutely. We've seen particular attention on the water sector. For one, ransomware is kind of a threat to all critical infrastructure. And sometimes that's cyber attackers who are sending out indiscriminate phishing attacks, trying to get whoever they can. But we've also seen some concerns around nation states. One really attention-grabbing incident was late last year. We had this Iran-linked group called Cyber Avengers that actually disrupted a pump at a Pittsburgh area water utility. And, in some ways we were lucky that they seemed like they were trying to send a message really with this rather than do something deeper. They were able to affect this pump on a supply line, and the utility had to switch to sort of backup methods to maintain water pressure. And some folks I've talked to pointed out that, if you're trying to get attention, water is unfortunately like a great target because it's an essential service, so people worry about it. It's likely to get headlines. It's also tends to be publicly owned, so there's going to likely be more disclosure about these kinds of incidents. One concern that's been raised is if China attacks Taiwan and the US is backing Taiwan, like that could be a point, and I've heard some people think that that could happen as soon as 2027. Someone else I talked to from the Center of Internet Security suggested hypothetically that we could have a nation-state attack critical infrastructure as a distraction technique to get the U.S. to focus on domestic affairs. One concern certainly around operational technology that's networked, and there's good reasons for doing that, but sometimes this can be like old and customized operational technology that may be difficult to patch, or there might not be always patches issued. And definitely there's reasons for networking it. It can really help, say you're a small rural utility with like a limited budget, you might be able to have one person remotely oversee different systems at once. Sometimes, unfortunately, like cyber basics can be an issue. With the issue with Cyber Avengers, it's believed the attackers got in because these devices, the particular devices they compromised, had default passwords still set up to 1111, and these were actually published online in manuals from the device manufacturer. So that's was something that you could have the push for Secure by Design to have manufacturers make changes there, say have default passwords that have to get set up so they have to get changed on first use. And also there's concerns around getting more training and sector-specific advice into the water sector and funding to make changes.
Is there a distinction to be made between rogue states and stateless rogues? Or are they just creating chaos together that makes life miserable for people who are trying to keep state and local utilities up?
Well, first, I'd like to speak to your last question, which I think is a really good one. There's this writer
called Anne Applebaum. She's kind of an expert on Eastern Europe, authoritarian movements, and she's written several respected books about the history of the Soviet Union. Her new book offers this thesis that the rogue states, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, are actually working kind of in tandem, or at least indirectly, with these rogue stateless operators all coming together in one big force. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm saying that is some of the thinking out there now. And I think that's some of the thinking. Everything that Jewel brought up is constantly on the minds of the public officials that I interviewed for my story about the whole of state cybersecurity efforts. One of my main courses is a leader from a small town in Indiana called Auburn. About 14,000 people live there. She says they're on the cusp of massive growth. They're a bedroom community to nearby Fort Wayne. And what keeps her up at night is not the traditional issues that kept small town politicians up at night about 2 decades ago when I used to cover small towns. Back then, it's like, can we afford the police department? What kind of grants are we getting for the states? Can we install sidewalks? She's up at night worrying about Taiwan, Iran, Ukraine. What's going to happen? Are these people going to find a way to take down her town's water utilities and basically derail their growth? All the financial and PR penalties that come from that.
And Jewel, let's also talk about the power grid. And it's also a core element of your story in the fall issue of GT. The power grid has got lots to worry about on a good day. Over demand, sometimes inadequate supply, and it's old and it's brittle and it's fragile. And that's before you account for cybersecurity. What does the cybersecurity concerns add to that undesirable mix?
Some of the same things with water, where there's fault typhoons also been positioning. Ransomware is a concern. I've also was talking to Maura Wynn from the Cybersecurity, Energy Security and Emergency Response at the Department of Energy, and she was pointing out that sometimes a cyber attack doesn't even need to really significantly disrupt an operation to still have an effect. If it sparks fear, people start thinking that they're not going to have, and that panic itself can be the desired result by an attacker. We're having some changes, of course, with energy as we're shifting somewhat to more renewables, and that raises a little bit of a different picture. With renewable, you're also having some changes where you're getting more different players involved, and they all need to pay attention to cybersecurity because attackers could try to see either of them as a potential way to enter the grid. There also tends to be a lot more remote monitoring and access controls for managing energy flow, and of course, internet connection, though, is something that is another way cyber attackers can look to try to get in, so I need to have a really attention to that as well. On the flip side, people also talk about some of the benefits. With these more distributed grids, you have the ability to do things like microgrids, where they can be part of the main grid, but if there's disruption happening to another part, can sort of segment off and function independently.
Have the players in the renewable energy space stepped up to cybersecurity, or is there still a fairly steep curve for them?
I think it's an evolving picture. I think there's been funding going into different kind of research and development efforts to look around different cybersecurity possibilities.
Your piece also discusses something that is a nice addition to government technology's traditional focus on state and local government, and that is space. Talk to me about the intersection of cybersecurity and space.
Yeah, so people talk about space systems having multiple sort of layers or segments, where you have the on the ground picture, then the objects in orbit, and the communications between the two. And there's sort of different concerns around them, right? We saw with 2022 the hack on Viasat disrupting satellite internet in the Ukraine. We've also seen solar weather having problems, where like solar flares earlier this year disrupted some of the GPS signals that farmers were using for precision planting, for guiding tractors really precisely, and some really stopped planting during that time. We hear about concerns around, the ability to potentially jam communications. There's also a report that came out earlier this year that was talking about sort of a whole list of different kinds of concerns to think about. Some hypothetical that talks about, say, theoretically, someone could try to falsify data coming from a satellite to create concerns. Someone theoretically distorted or falsified information coming from it to indicate, there could be a collision that could cause panic on the ground. One concern also as well is that a lot of these satellites stay in orbit for a very long time, maybe 10 to 15 years. And of course, cyber security concerns evolve quickly. And so it can be limits to how much you can update them based on the hardware. And it can be hard to investigate an incident if you can't physically inspect like a satellite to see, was it just a natural equipment failure? Did something happen? There's been some discussion too that there's not currently very like clear international cyber norms around space. Some space treaties, are pretty far before we had modern concerns. So that's another area that's been raised as well.
Thad, down here on Earth, systems get old. Legacy systems, networks, and even what were once new digital technologies age out at alarmingly quick speeds given the rate of change everywhere else. What does the vulnerability landscape look like now?
Well, it's getting better, but there's still a lot of unease out there. A lot of the agencies that I cover in my story, they are using federal grants. There's a $1 billion federal grant program in place now. And that's getting some work done. Texas, New York State, even the relatively small state of New Hampshire is getting in on that action. And they're all taking different approaches to it as well. But there's a lot of concern that the money might run out, depending, for instance, on who gets elected this fall. There is a lot of concern that this, absent some dramatic breach or dramatic takedown of a utility, for instance, some of this energy might run out. I talked to one tech leader for another small town in the Midwest. This didn't make it in my story, but he is pretty aggressive in seeking out state help for his own cybersecurity efforts in his small town. But the town next to him, they just voted down funding for new cybersecurity there. So there's the fear and the vulnerability that citizens either just don't want to pay for it, or citizens are not persuaded of the importance of these cybersecurity efforts. But I think some of them, and not to repeat what Jewel was saying, but I think when it comes to how they feel vulnerable, I hear over and over again, utilities, utilities, utilities. Then comes election systems, which is understandable given that the election is mere months away.
Let's spend a couple more minutes on small and rural communities. What's unique there in terms of vulnerabilities?
Well, they don't always have the most up-to-date cybersecurity software, nor do they always have access to the top-of-the-line real-time alert information that larger agencies and large law enforcement agencies often have. As well, there's a talent problem there. Not every tech expert, not every tech professional wants to live in a smaller town with relatively low pay. I mean, that can be a hard sell, especially among some of the younger set. Vendors are trying to step into this, trying to offer more managed and unified services to these smaller towns. Also sometimes these smaller towns can piggyback onto larger cybersecurity contract deals that are basically operated at the state level too. So that's helping them out too. But they need more help, and they also obviously need more funding. I mean, everyone needs more funding. And they're trying to kind of put their hands up in a crowded field. Hey, we matter too, because we might be a small town, but if we go down, some of these impacts can build, some of these impacts can cascade, and they are very well aware of that.
Given the holistic nature of that perspective you just described, and that everything is related to everything else where cybersecurity is concerned, it's an area where jurisdictions and other entities don't want to go it alone. Both of you write about collaborative efforts in mounting defenses and also going on the offense in all of this area. Give me a sense of that part of the story. And Joel, you want to lead out?
I mean, there's certainly federal resources to, at times provide training and supports like that. There's, I know Cesar had a recent also program with some universities, and I think part of that was creating degree programs around trying to train up people who can have sort of the mixed skill set of cyber and some of the engineering skills that might come into place, say with securing the energy grid.
What I really picked up with the interviews I did is a hunger for more access to real-time cybersecurity alerts. People want to know what to look for, especially as it changes all the time. The threats keep evolving. I mean, these criminals are, some of them are extremely intelligent people, and they're hard to track down. And I get a lot of hunger. We want to see what the state police might see, for instance, or what the state chief information security officer might see, or even what the FBI might see. There's a lot of hunger for access to those alerts, that real-time data. Vendors are, trying to answer to that demand, but it's still not there yet.
So looking back at calendar year 2024 on the cybersecurity front, much has been written and will be written about the CrowdStrike failure.
Mm-hmm.
There appears to be two different schools of thought. One is that the failure points to the need to diversify your providers. And then there's another school of thought that says this is way too important to rely on somebody other than the best in the business. What did the two of you hear from your sources as you've been covering that?
I'm going to base this on what I hear from sources, not only for this cybersecurity story, but in my regular daily business beat coverage. The trend is towards having fewer suppliers, one supplier who can do it all. I don't see that energy dissipating anytime soon, at least from the point of view of reporting on the vendors in the GovTech space. It can save significant money and headache for towns, especially smaller towns, to, hey, this is the best in the business. This is our GovTech supplier. We don't want to deal with 3 different points of contact on this. So I think the trends towards so-called unified services still has a lot of strength, no matter this CrowdStrike failure or not.
And Jewel, what are you hearing?
I've heard some discussion around a little bit mixed, partially saying these large providers, even if something happened in this case, saying that this is, they still tend to have resources, right, for cybersecurity. And and like that said, trying to avoid some complexity. I've heard some suggestions of trying to look at, can you have one backup provider? Can you look at ways that you switch over to maybe one other alternate?
Mm-hmm.
I've also heard talk about relooking at contracts and negotiations with vendors or how you work with them. Whether that's, in the CrowdStrike instance specifically, the issue was around an update. So whether there's making sure that you have an agreement that lets you have more controls around how updates happen or are tested, or trying to have agreements around what kind of liability or support your vendor's going to give you if they have an issue, is something I've heard. But I don't think I've really heard a lot of saying we're going to pull widely back from these big providers. Interesting stuff. We will continue to follow your work at govtech.com, and we'll have links to the cover story package on cybersecurity in the show notes at tfic.tech. Thank you both for your time and for your reporting. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Paul.
Thad Reuter and Jewel Patterson-Gordon wrote the cover package on cybersecurity for the fall issue of Government Technology magazine. Our editorial and production team includes Theo Douglas, Zoe Manzanetti, and Kaylee Tedrow. Our executive editor is Noel Nell.
In the coming weeks, we have deep dives into 2 organizations that have been instrumental in the decades-long campaign for digital government. In 2 weeks, a state-of-state IT conversation with Executive Director of NASCIO on the eve of its national conference in New Orleans. And next week, we talk the trajectory of civic tech and the changing dynamics around equity with the CEO of Code for America. You don't want to miss those interviews or the balance of our fall season. Subscribe today for free on Apple or Spotify. Search for The Future in Context.
That's next time. And that's it for us this time out. For Ashley Silver, I'm Paul Taylor. Always forward.